Welcome Richie and invite you to the front.
Thank you, Father. I'm just saying there to Liam, it's nearly easier hurling in front of 82,000 people than stand up here. But no, I suppose I'm here to, tell my story tonight. As was introduced earlier, I've had a very successful, hurling career. I spent 11 years hurling with Kilkenny senior team, and I suppose what people didn't know at the time was for 9 of those years I was suffering with a chronic addiction. Today I'm still a compulsive gambler, but I have years of recovery behind me, thank God. So I suppose starting from the very beginning, I come from a family of 5, two brothers, 2 sisters, myself, mum and dad. I grew up in a very, very small village in Kilkenny called Stonyford, and there's one shop, one pub, one church, one community fields and one school. And for me growing up, my time was spent in school from 9 o'clock until 3, and then probably from 3 o'clock until 7, 8, 9 down in the local community pitch, playing hurling, playing soccer, playing football. Every sport that you can imagine I played as a young child. And I suppose addiction would have played no part in my family, in dad and mum's extended family. It was never something that we had to deal with as a family. And for me growing up, my dad hurled for Kilkenny. He won All Irelands for Kilkenny, and that's all I wanted to do. That's all I wanted to do. I wanted to follow in Dad's footsteps. I idolised Dad, still do to this day, and that was the dream. To put on a Kilkenny jersey and represent my county and my club at the highest level. And from primary school in Stonyford, I moved into St. Kieran's College, and obviously people will be well aware of St. Kieran's. It's the nursery for hurling in Kilkenny, and that's where I suppose my hurling started to really take off. And I suppose unfortunately for me, it was during my time in Kieran's that I would have also placed my first bet. My mum and dad decided to put me in boarding for 5th and 6th year because I was so involved in sport that they were worried that I wouldn't have time to study at home, whereas boarding gave me the opportunity to play sport, but also you had no real choice only to study because you were put into a study hall from 6:15 until 9:30. So unfortunately, 5th year in St. Kieran's College would have been the time when I placed my first bet. We would have always kind of got time after school from 4 o'clock until 5:30 to either go downtown or stay around the school and go play hurling or puck around or train. And it was just during this time that one evening I decided to walk into a bookmaker's and place a bet, and I suppose probably to my detriment, my first bet was a winning bet. And I suppose from there, it grew to have such a huge impact on my life up until the year 2013. And, it's something that I suppose I'm not proud of, but it's also, I suppose, part of my journey and part of my story. And, I finished my 2 years. I got a very good leaving cert and wanted to become a primary school teacher. And to do that, I didn't get enough points through my leaving to go directly to it, but I could go through an arts degree in St. Pat's College in Drumcondra. And that's where I set off. It was a 3 years degree, and I suppose the unfortunate thing for me, the arts degree at the time was only 7 or 8 hours a week, and only 2 hours were signing. So really, from a Sunday evening to a Friday evening, I only had to be in college for 3 hours a week. And that's when my gambling really started to escalate for me. Was in college in Dublin. I can safely say the 3 years I spent in St. Pat's Drumcondra was probably the real start of my addiction. And again, not because because of the college or anything like that. It's just because I had so much free time, and gambling just took a hold of me from the very early stage. And I knew very early in my addiction that what I was doing was wrong. But like any addiction, it just grabbed such a hold of me. It isolated me from friends, from family, from relationships. And during all this, I was after getting called into the Kilkenny senior panel, which, as I said earlier, was a dream of mine. And so I was trying to juggle college, my gambling, hurling with Kilkenny, family life, personal life. So I suppose the way I'd best describe it is I was living three lives. I had my sporting life, my family life, and then there was my gambling life. And my gambling life was complete secrecy and completely done in private, done on my own. As I said, I isolated myself from family, friends, and the deeper I got into my addiction, the more my life started to, I suppose, fall around and crumble around me. And I done my best to, I suppose, pretend that everything was okay and everything was fine. And I became very good at it. I became a compulsive liar, and it got to a stage where the lies I was telling, I was nearly believing them myself because I didn't know any better. I didn't know any truth. I hurt a lot of people. I would have manipulated a lot of people, and it was all because of my addiction. And there's a very wise man in our GA group in Kilkenny that always says that gambling can make dirt of decent people. And for me, growing up, my mum, my dad worked every hour that they could to make sure that the five of us had everything that we needed. And my mum drove me the length and breadth of the country hurling, you name it. And they installed in us growing up to be honest people and hard working. And my addiction stripped me of all of that for many years. And as I said, it's something that I'm not proud of. But unfortunately for me, I wouldn't have known an awful lot about addiction, but I definitely knew what I was doing. I was gambling, you could say 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I decided against going on and finishing my teaching to go and take a job just in order to feed my addiction. I never went and finished out my teaching, which is a huge regret that I have. But again, it's part of my story and part of my journey. And even through this, I was winning All Irelands with Kilkenny. I think anyone looking from the outside in must have thought that we were all living the dream, and we were travelling the world on team holidays, winning All Irelands. And for all of my teammates and that, it certainly was. They were living the dream. But for me personally, I was living a lie. For me, hurling was an escape. I was, for that hour and a half that I was on a hurling pitch, I didn't have to deal with the turmoil that I was dealing with in my personal life. And that's exactly what it was. It was turmoil. It was hell. Gambling stripped me of all confidence that I had, any self-belief that I have. It destroyed me for years, and there was nights after nights that I would have cried myself to sleep in bed because the damage that I would have done that day, that week, that month, the people that I hurt, the people that I lied to, and it was all because I wasn't strong enough to ask for help. People say the hardest thing to do is ask for help, and sometimes it is. But for me, for years and years, I was screaming inside for someone to help me, but I wasn't physically able to say the words. And I suppose 2013 was the year that everything changed. for me, though my three lives were just about to collide and just explode in front of me. And, thankfully it did at that time, and my dad, my family were probably the ones that really, really suffered throughout this time, because they were constantly being told and constantly being contacted that, I was gambling a lot, I was seen in bookies a lot. And 2013, my form on the field had become very erratic, to say the least. And we got to a senior county final in Kilkenny that year in 2013, which was a huge, huge thing in our club. And we wouldn't have won a senior championship since the 50s. And we had a real, real opportunity. But unfortunately, we came up 2 points short. And that was on a Sunday. And the Monday, as you do after games, we socialised together and we drowned our sorrows together. And my dad got up that Tuesday morning and was going back to work. And he was driving down our road from our house, and you get to a T-junction and you turn left to go into Kilkenny, and right brings you to Waterford. And supposed to go to Kilkenny. For whatever reason, the car and he drove to Tramore, parked up the car, and the Strand in Tramore for 3 or 4 hours. And one went through his head for that 3 or 4 hours, and what's wrong with Richie? And that referring to myself. He knew the old Richie, or the same Richie, and I think he knew deep down what the issue was. I suppose it was probably a hard thing for them to make to it, or they didn't really understand how it was. But they caught me out to the only for that weekend. Down. My mum, my dad, my brother and older sister were sitting at the kitchen table, and he just asked me straight out. He said, "Are you gambling?" And I said yes. And that was the beginning of, my recovery. But the hardest thing for me that night and the following weeks and months was, I saw that night what it was doing to my family, and the upset and how worried they were about me. But I felt nothing. I was emotionless. I just couldn't feel anything, because I was so numb inside that I didn't realise what I was doing to him at home. And that was a hard thing for me at the time, because you couldn't be emotional, or you couldn't break down, because I didn't know what those emotions were. And that was really, really tough. And from there I then got a phone call and called into a meeting to be told that I was no longer part of the Kilkenny senior panel. And people will often say, like, that must have been the hardest meeting that you've ever been in, or for your dream to be taken away from you. But I think I knew, walking out of Hotel Kilkenny that night, that I had a much bigger battle ahead of me, and that was to get on the road of recovery and stay on that road of recovery. And that's where I suppose my energy, my time went, from that time on. And it hasn't always been plain sailing, far from it. But that, I suppose, night in October 2013 was, as I said, the beginning of my recovery. And it's been a long road, it's been a hard road, it's been a tough road at times to, I suppose, accept some of the things that I've done, to, I suppose, try and make up to people for things that I would have done and how it would have affected them. But for a long, long time, the hardest part was to move on, and I suppose to look forward and to, I suppose, build for the future, because I had so many regrets, and I kept beating myself up with all those regrets. And eventually I got to a stance where I just decided that, this is my story. I'm able to own it now. I'm able to speak about it. It took me a long, long time to be confident enough to do that, because I only publicly came out probably 4 years ago to tell my story. And part of the reason for doing that is to also try and help people, because the life that I lived when I was gambling was, as I said, for me it was hell, and it's a life that I wouldn't wish on anyone. I really, really wouldn't wish it on anyone. My dad often said that he would have much preferred if I was an alcoholic or a drug addict, because it would show physically on you, whereas gambling is so silent, it's so secretive. You can just, and I became so good at pretending that I was okay, even though my life was falling apart around me. I lost relationships because of it. In that time, I became a father for the first time in 2009, and it's not something that I'm proud of, but I missed out on so much of Rory's first 3 or 4 years, and it kills me to stand up here and say that, but it's the truth. And I got a second chance when Richie Og was born 3 years ago, and I haven't missed one single thing of Richie Og's first few years, and that's brilliant. That's what recovery has given me. But it also upsets me because I missed out on it with Rory. But obviously that was because of my addiction, and that's what my addiction done to me. It caused me to miss out on so much of the important things. And to me today, what's life like for me today? Very, very simple. I got engaged in January, which when I was in my addiction, I never ever thought that would happen to me, when all my friends around me were getting married and building houses and having kids. I only recently got news that we got approved for a mortgage. And again, that's something that I never thought was possible when I was gambling, because I never had money. I genuinely was living from day to day, from week to week, from paycheck to paycheck. And that's what I suppose recovery has given me, is these things. And I enjoy all of these things today. I enjoy doing things like this because I believe if it helps one person, it's worth doing. And what I would say to people here tonight is, if you have a family or a friend or a son or a daughter, husband or a wife, that maybe hasn't been themselves in the last weeks or months, and you've seen a change in their demeanor or their attitude, or that, just ask them, are they okay? I would have been asked numerous times by my dad, my mum, my brothers and sisters, are you okay? And obviously my answer was yes, but I wasn't. I wasn't strong enough to ask for help because my addiction wouldn't allow me. And and I'll finish with this. I've done a few talks in schools recently and over the last number of years, and I went up to do a talk in a school in Dublin probably 18 months ago. And the contact came through my dad, and he came with me. I'd say it was probably the first time he's listened to me speak about my addiction and how it affected me. And at the end of my talk, the principal asked my dad if he wanted to say a few words. And this is on the back of years of recovery. My dad took the mic, and there was about 400 or 500 students in the hall, and he just took the mic and he said a simple sentence, and he asked them, please don't gamble, because gambling destroys families. And that has stayed with me today. Every morning I wake up, that sentence comes into my head, because regardless of how many years of recovery I had behind me, that's how much pain and suffering that I caused during my addiction. But what I can do today, and all I can do today, is just try and be a better person and be the person that Dad and Mum reared us to be. And as I said, life is not always perfect, it's not always rosy, and I had my good days, I had my bad days. Thankfully I have my GA group in Kilkenny, which I go to every Thursday night, which is a huge, huge help to me. And that's, I suppose, what recovery has done for me. I'm not going to stand here and worship or say that I'll never gamble again or bet again, because I don't know. I genuinely can't say that. I don't ever want to gamble. I don't ever want to place another bet. But I can't stand here and say that I never will. But as long as I keep doing the right things, keep going to my meetings, keep talking to the people closest to me, and being honest, I know then that I have a really, really good chance. Thank you.